What a week it has been in the state of Michigan in politics. While the governor is calling for unity, the Republicans are saying, not so fast. That road goes two ways. To talk a little bit more, we're going to bring in Dave Boucher. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. What a week you've had, huh?
Yeah, it just never ends. Never ends. It's been a pretty chaotic beat for several months now.
Right. You think, oh, I'm going to be able to catch my breath this week? Doesn't happen.
No, plenty of news, which is always good for readers and for the state to see what everybody's up to.
I will say one of the good things about this craziness and the election and the politics, it seems more and more people are paying attention to the process than they ever did before. Unfortunately, it's still very polarizing. So if we can kind of start with the governor's state of the state, what did you think of her speech?
Yeah, so this was an unusual state of the state in an unusual time, right? It was a virtual address. It was only online. It's roughly 25 minutes, which is pretty short for a state of the state. There was no pause for applause sort of thing, and it wasn't in the state capitol. There was really, not a lot of pomp and circumstance. And the entire speech, just like everybody else's life right now, was centered on COVID and the pandemic. So we didn't hear perhaps the big new proposals that are often seen and heard in a state of the state, but we heard a commitment to not only end the pandemic, but remember those who were lost and fight to restore businesses and provide funding for people who need it. Obviously, as you know, Republicans are skeptical and have long been critical of her approach to the pandemic, and that has kind of kicked off some of the partisan bickering that we've seen this week.
Especially at a time when you're calling for unity. And then you had the Republicans, Shirkey and who was it, Whitmer, who came out and said, wait a minute, we've only met with you once in person for a conversation. It's like, what's going on?
Yeah, there's clearly a division right now between the legislature and the governor, and part of that is intentional, right? Like that's the point of the legislature is at times to be a check on the governor. And Senate Majority Leader Shirkey was quick to point that out. But you're right, the governor tried to focus in theory on unity and on bringing people together. Republicans would note that during the campaign season, just like every other politician, that the governor was very critical of the president and of Republicans. And so I think some people are saying, oh, now you want to talk about unity after you were not, after you were partisan, but that's what partisans do on both the Republican and the Democratic side. They advocate for their own side and their own ideas, and they point out why they think their opponent is worse. But you're right. The Republicans in the House and the Senate immediately came out this week, took some legislative actions, some policy actions that are aimed, in their opinion, at curbing the governor's unilateral power to address the pandemic.
Well, and this is an issue not even just here in the state of Michigan, but you're starting to see more and more legislators across the country start to bring up this issue to try to curb the powers of the governor and people of her administration.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, right? The Constitution, which is what state lawmakers will quickly point out, the Constitution made the legislature a co-equal branch with the executive, and the legislature has the power to not only write laws, but set the budget for the state. And so lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, argue that the governor has not done enough to include them in the decision-making process to address a pandemic. The governor would argue, and the executive would argue, that there is nothing stopping lawmakers from coming up with proposals, from presenting ideas, from passing laws, from calling her and taking any number of actions necessary in order to fight the pandemic themselves. And she has argued that they have been too slow and too reticent to take critical actions needed in order to save the lives and potentially businesses of others. Obviously, that's contentious and people can argue with that. But that just shows you how wide the chasm is right now between the people that are supposed to be leading our state in a very critical time.
And the two sides come together.
It's so easy to come together. You and I are having a Skype call, a Zoom call right now. One would imagine that the people that 10 million Michiganders entrust with the state government could figure out how to do it. Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey said that there are some things you can't get done in a Zoom meeting. He didn't respond to my questions about what exactly those things are when it comes to fighting the pandemic. He says that there have been lots of presentations from the governor, but not conversations. His office didn't respond to questions to why Mike Shirkey, the highest ranking Republican in state government, couldn't ask the governor questions during a presentation. They didn't respond to questions about why he hasn't invited her to a meeting. I mean, there's the fact that the state government and the leaders of the state government are fighting over whether or not they're having meetings as opposed to specific policy agendas or items related to the pandemic is probably concerning to small businesses who need help, to frontline workers who are desperate for more vaccines, and to everybody in the state who just wants to get an injection in their arm and try to return to a normal pace and speed of life.
Yeah, and with all of that, with the last thing we need, the two sides being in a public bickering match about meetings and not being a part of the conversation and this, that, and the other. It's time for them to roll up their sleeves and get to work, because at the end of the day, they also work for us. We are the taxpayers. And with that, I know that there's been a lot of discussion about the governor and her lack of transparency. Are you getting any inside information about the reason why the health director stepped down?
No, we aren't. I found out, like many other people found out, including we've heard people in the health department found out that Robert Gordon was leaving the Department of Health and Human Services when he tweeted about it last Friday. So we heard about that. We heard it from him first on Twitter. When the governor put out her announcement, she didn't thank him for his service. She just announced that his replacement was set. Lawmakers who I talked to weren't a big fan of Director Gordon. They thought that Republican lawmakers, I should clarify, thought that he wasn't a very good communicator and that he didn't listen not only to them but to interest groups who wanted to know more about the decision making behind some of the policies in place. They do seem to appreciate the appointed director, Elizabeth Hertel. They say that they've had better conversations with her. One person pointed out to me that she's a Michigander and that Robert Gordon was not, which is apparently an issue or something that they thought was important. But no, we're not hearing any more from the health department or the governor's office about why Robert Gordon left. The governor repeatedly dodged questions about whether or not he was asked to resign or whether or not he wanted to resign. She's noted that it has been a grueling 2 years that he's been atop the health department. There's been a litany of issues. There were protesters who were protesting outside of his house in the fall, trying to advocate for him to roll back some of these health and safety restrictions. And he has been definitely the focal point of a lot of ire related to some of these health and safety orders. But no, we don't have a clearer picture exactly why he decided to leave.
Well, you can read between the lines here. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that there was some type of dispute between them, whether or not she asked him to step down or he left on his own. I've worked in the government, and typically, those, even if one individual leaves, excuse me, especially as Gordon in such a high position, they would still do the public thank you. We appreciate your time. And the fact that there wasn't, we all know there was some type of dispute. Do you know if he got any type of severance package at all?
I don't know that. I have put in requests for information, as I'm assuming has every other reporter on the beat, and we are trying to figure out more information. But no, I have not heard that. I do think, again, it is the governor and the state have stressed that there is a continuity of leadership here, which is a really critical moment to have an interim leader of a health department. Right? Obviously, at any given point, the head of a department or cabinet officials can leave in state government, but the state keeps telling us we're at the height of the pandemic, that even though there's a light at the end of the tunnel, there's lots of actions that need to take place, including distributing tens of thousands, if not millions, of vaccine doses. And there's this transition in leadership. So that's why that's why we're asking questions, trying to figure out if something went wrong or not, or if the director just wanted to leave. But no, everybody wants to know a little bit more.
So with that too, if we can kind of shift, sorry, I have a frog in my throat. If we can shift to Governor Whitmer, do you think she's going to run for re-election?
Yeah, I don't have any inside information on that, but there's no indication that she wouldn't be running for re-election. Obviously, there's been just a ton of reporting that she had the opportunity to potentially join President Biden, or either leading up to in the vice presidential role or in potentially other roles. She's a top role with the DNC, the Democratic campaign arm. That's on the side to what she's doing as the governor. That's typically a ceremonial role. It doesn't take a ton of time away from what you're doing. No, and her national profile has raised substantially in the 2 years that she's been governor. She has obviously a better relationship with the Biden administration than with the Trump administration, which in theory puts her in a better spot to to hear from the federal government, to get federal resources, and to just not, frankly, be fighting with the president on a consistent basis. And we haven't seen a clear Republican front-runner candidate announced yet. Candace Miller announced that she wasn't going to run, and we haven't seen anybody who would be an obvious, huge challenger for her announced yet. So all of that is indicating that, yeah, she's probably going to run. I think it would be a big surprise if she didn't run. And clearly, like every other incumbent, she would be the front runner and the favorite at this point.
But what's fascinating about this is, like you said, while no Republican has come forward, there are rumblings within the Democratic Party that Mark Hackl, the Macomb County executive, has his eye set on the governor's seat. And in an unusual move throughout this pandemic, he has not been so fond of Whitmer or some of the decisions that she's been making.
Yeah, as you pointed out, he's been a little bit critical of the state government. I know we reported on a YouTube video that he posted where it was where he somewhat dramatically opened up a refrigerator to show that there weren't any vaccines in the county and that they need more vaccines, just like I would note every other local provider in the state. The health department and the governor are quick to note that they have distributed every single vaccine that they say they have, but there's obviously some sort of disconnect going on, given the fact that there are roughly 1.5 million vaccines in the state and only 800,000 have been administered. That number keeps going up every day, but that discrepancy is something that, as you noted, he's pointed out. It is incredibly difficult as a Democrat to run against a Democratic incumbent. It's essentially unheard of for that to be successful, not only in Michigan, but anywhere. So, he can, obviously this can help raise his political profile to some degree, but it's not a highly successful route that I think many Democrats are actually seriously considering.
Yeah, I'm still interested in why he's been so openly, publicly critical of Whitmer and some of the decisions that she's made, because it is quite unusual as well when you come from the same party. With that too, as we go forward, of course, funding is going to be a big issue. Now that Biden is president, the governor really has no finger to point. Because before on the failures, she was able to say, hey, it's because of the Trump administration. So going forward, now that Biden is the president, is she going to be able to make those arguments? Well, she can't. I mean, she's not going to want to point the finger at the federal government and Biden's administration. So she needs to figure out a way to fix some of these problems.
Yeah, and to your point, the state needed to figure out how to fix those problems beforehand when President Trump was still in office. But it seems pretty obvious that the Republicans in the state legislature are giving her an opportunity to continue to find somebody to be her foil, right? So Congress appropriated billions of dollars to Michigan and every other state in the late winter for COVID relief. And those funds are generally earmarked for very specific issues, for example, to help roll out vaccine distribution, to help reimburse the National Guard, who are also helping with testing, that sort of thing. But the state legislature has to formally appropriate those funds. And right now, the Republicans in the legislature are not doing that. They are currently threatening to withhold $2 billion in federal education funds unless the governor agrees to a law that would shift some, not all, some pandemic powers from her administration to local health officials. So obviously, you're right, the governor doesn't have the Trump administration to point to, but there's $2 billion, more than that, sitting in the state right now that lawmakers could appropriate that would seemingly help speed up the rollout. Republicans say would help get students back into in-person classes faster, help with testing, help with rental and insurance and assistance, help with getting people who need food, the ability to eat, and that's not happening right now. The Republicans say it's not politics, that they're making a point, that they should have a bigger say in the process. They have a say. There's a lot of money on the table right now that they get to appropriate, and it hasn't happened yet. So that's going to be the fight. The governor is going to be fighting with the Republicans in the legislature, as we've already seen this week.
Well, and then on top of that, when they blocked the governor's appointees this week, that really kind of sent a pretty strong message.
Yeah, I'm not sure who comes out of that victorious, or if this is really a winning and losing situation. Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey said it wasn't to score political points, it was to make a point. I'm not sure that the people who rely on the services of those boards are getting that point. or who's winning in this situation. Again, these people are appointed to these typically low profile bureaucratic positions in order to help ease and pass regulations and oversee departments that help people. So the idea that those departments and those agencies are better served by not having people on the board is seemingly a difficult argument to make. At the same time, obviously, again, the Republicans in the legislature have been saying that the governor is acting unilaterally. We haven't heard a lot about what it would look like for her not to act unilaterally, like if it would require her to come sit down on the floor of the Senate or to invite people over for like coffee or something. We haven't heard what the Republicans want to see as far as this idea of not acting unilaterally. But you're right, that was something that happened this week, and the Republicans think that was an effective message sent to the governor.
Yeah, I will say, if I was her, you really need to extend that olive branch right now, because that's going to make you look more like the winner. Because I think so many people are looking at both sides and saying, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. Businesses are still closing. Kids are still struggling to learn. And you guys are acting like children up there. And so you wonder too, when you come out of this, really, it's like there are no winners on either side, Republicans or Democrats, if they continue down this path.
Yeah, it's politics. And the Speaker of the House, Jason Whitmer, has told me and has said multiple times that people hate political bickering and they hate political back and forths. And then yesterday, he and Senate Majority Leader Shirkey acknowledged engaging in it. And so one can argue that this is what you do, and that this is, to your point, it is the start of the gubernatorial season. It's not an election year, but it's always an election cycle. And so this is part of that. These are the Republicans who are in charge and leading Republicans in the state. But yeah, if we're putting it in perspective of political winners and losers, somebody might come out with more political points. But as far as policy goes, as far as helping people goes, it's difficult to see who's winning in this.
Dave Boucher with us. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Dave, do you cover the city of Detroit as well?
Sparingly, but no, that is not my beat.
I thought it was interesting this week, just in a general overview of Anthony Adams coming out announcing that he will be running against Mayor Mike Duggan for the upcoming election in the city of Detroit, and to be the next mayor for the city of Detroit. Behind the scenes, interesting. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it'll be a fun campaign to watch. It'll be fun to see. Again, just in general, very hard to beat an incumbent. Hard to beat incumbent who has a relatively national profile, who can raise funds, who has connections to big Democratic donors. But if the city of Detroit decides that it's time to change, then that'll be fun to watch.
Well, and of course, the announcement came the same time as Kwame Kilpatrick was being released from prison. I believe Sheila Cockrell is now saying that she may be considering a bid for the mayor as well. It's like old school politics. Sometimes things just don't change. It's the same players and just a different day.
I think voters would agree with that. The voters would see that there are a lot of the familiar names and faces are the ones that they keep finding on their ballots.
So with that, Dave, anything that we didn't touch on that you want to share with us?
Again, I think it's a huge week and a huge time for the legislature. Everybody wants to try and do something to increase the speed of vaccine rollout and increase the way that students get back into classes safely. And we're going to see, I think, some legislative action next week that could potentially start moving some of that legislation to the governor. Whether or not they're able to find legislative compromise is really we're going to see some of that either next week or the week after, as kind of this fight escalates into how anybody cannot use these federal funds who are dedicated to Michigan and are just kind of sitting there while lawmakers and the governor agree exactly where to send them.
So Dave, have you been on some of the press conferences on those Zoom calls, especially when the governor was talking about shutting down high school sports and talking about the metrics? Are we missing something there? Because it seems like she's not providing some of the science and the data, and that seems to be fueling the fight to try to get the kids playing sports again.
Yeah, that's obviously something that people are very passionate about, chiefly the kids playing sports and their parents and some of the athletic directors. That was something that was going on in the Capitol yesterday with some resolutions. The biggest argument to your point about this idea that the governor is not providing metrics The metrics that people want to see, that we've heard, that critics have said, are if the governor were to say, if the test capacity were to hit X, then Y can happen. And we haven't heard that yet, right? So the governor would argue that this is a really fluid time and it's difficult to actually set those parameters.
Well, it's been great having you here with us.